resource monitoring. So in this module, we'll take a look at the different resource monitoring tools that vSphere provides to us and how we can use this to monitor our core resources in our infrastructure. So vSphere collects data on resource utilization on most objects within our inventory. This is done at frequent intervals and they are archived in the vCenter server database. Okay, so we can now access this data through command line utilities like ESXstop or remote ESXstop. We could also access them through our GUI in the form of performance charts in the vSphere web client. So there are a number of different places where resources can be monitored in the environment. We could monitor our CPU resources, memory resources, our disk and network resources. Okay, so these resources can be monitored both from within the guest OS and from outside of the guest OS at the host level. So apart from host level, we have a couple different other places where we could monitor our resources. But once we get to our performance chart, I'll go through some of the different ways and places where we could monitor our resource utilization. Within the guest OS, we can use tools like Performance Monitor or Perfmon in Windows and Windows Task Manager. Okay, so we'll get to this too once we start demonstrating this in our lab. Outside of the guest OS, we can use tools like our vCenter Performance Charts, vCenter Operations Manager. We could look at our vSphere and ESXi logs. As I mentioned, we could use the ESXstop and remote ESXstop. And many of these tools are already built into vSphere. There's an exception, for example, the remote ESXstop. Before we could get this up and running, we'll need to deploy vSphere Management Assistant. But we'll get to that as we progress in the course, since I have a separate module for setting up of that and using our remote ESX top commands to monitor our ESXi host. So we'll cover that in a separate module. I have a slide here with the different tools that we can use to monitor our infrastructure. In this particular section, I'll look at the performance charts, but as we progress throughout the course, we'll take a look at these others that we have here in the list. Our command line utilities, ESXstop and remote ESXstop mainly, we'll deal with here. We'll take a look at events, alerts, and alarms, and setting up alarms on our objects within our inventory. We'll have a look at the different log files, and then finally here we'll take a look at our syslog collector and our ESXi DOM collector, which are built into our vCenter server. Okay, so we'll get to all of these as we progress. So for now, we'll just take a look at performance charts, how to navigate around it, how to add or remove counters for an object that we're trying to monitor. Okay, so let me get my vSphere web client up and we'll get straight into this here. Before we get into the details of this here, let me take a minute or so and just go through our performance chart before we actually get into the demonstration. So the performance charts data, they can be gathered from our data center, our cluster, our host, our resource pool, our VApps, and our virtual machine objects. We could print these charts. We could print them. We could also export them to PNG, JPEG, or CSV. We could export them for later analysis if you need to pull this into Excel and analyze the data in more detail there. What you should also try to do is, as you follow along here or in your infrastructure, once you're monitoring your resource utilization or usage, you should monitor at both the guest OS level and from the host or vCenter server level to have a better picture or a more complete picture of our resources that we are monitoring. Okay, so for these objects that I just highlighted, we can monitor them from the performance tab. Okay, so we have two kinds of charts that we can use here. Firstly, we have the overview chart. Um, the overview chart, these display common metrics for an object. Okay, so actually, let me pull this up as we are here. So I'll go to the host and cluster view. We could monitor at the cluster level, the data center level, the host level, resource pool, or the VM level. But in our case here, I'll just pull up one of my hosts. ESXi1 have a couple virtual machines running right now. Okay, so ESXi1, if I go to the monitor tab here, okay, and then to performance tab, I have two options here. I have the overview graphs, and then I have the advanced one here, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So for overview, here we have a display of the most common metrics for an object. So in this particular case here, we're looking at our ESXi or host object. We can have a quick overview of our CPU, memory, disk, and network resources without having to view multiple charts. So we could have a quick overview here. These are shown side by side. They're stacked here too, so we could easily view this. As compared to the advanced chart, so the advanced chart would basically display counters for data not displayed in the overview chart. For navigation purposes, if I was to move to a virtual machine over here, okay, if I was to just click on that virtual machine, it will just bring me back straight to monitoring performance because this was already highlighted. We are already in the performance tab or context here. So I could easily move between objects in my inventory and monitor the resources. So let's go back to our host where we were here. All right. So for the view here, um, we have the options of looking at the virtual machines on this on this ESXi host. ESXi, sorry about that. Or we could view the actual virtual machines. Cluster level, if I was to click on the cluster level here, this home here would be home for the cluster. Okay, so below that, then I will have the options of monitoring my host and my virtual machines. And on this cluster, we have a couple resource pools too, so we have the option of monitoring that. If I move up to the data center level, then go to monitor, and then onto performance here. Okay, so my view would differ here too. So I have my cluster view or storage from this level. Okay, so you would spend more time in your host, the actual ESXi host resources that you're monitoring. So let's go back here to our host. Okay, so we have by default a couple counters that are already set up here for us. We have our CPU percentage. Okay, so this is CPU utilization on our ESXi host. So in this context here, we're looking at ESXi1. So this is the CPU utilization or usage percentage. Okay, we should have the actual value in megahertz later in one of the chart here. For our memory ballooning, in megabytes here if it was currently doing that. Um, we have our memory swap in rate and swap out rate counters. This is in megabytes per second. Okay. We have latency we are monitoring here too. This is in millisecond for this there. Okay. Coming down in our list, this is what I was mentioning. We have our CPU in megahertz, so usage in megahertz, and then above here we have usage in percentage. Okay, so we're currently using 3000 megahertz on this whole CPU. Okay, and this is both for overhead and for running of our virtual machine. All right, so coming down in the list here, we have memory percentage usage. Okay, and so we are basically utilizing what about 85% of this host memory. Okay. Um, Over here we have this in kilobytes per second and this usage. Okay. And then we have our network chart here. This is in megabits per second. Okay. So this is just a quick summary of our resources. But where you would want to do most of your work is in the advanced view here. You have lots more options of modifying the counters that we're trying to monitor. Um, Before we move to advanced, the time range here by default this is set to 1 day here. We could modify this. We could modify this. We could do this in real time, for example. Okay. So we'll go out and pull that data there. We could do it in real time. We could do it for a week. We could set a custom period. If you're monitoring here for a specific period, we could enter that here and just hit on the arrow there. Okay. Um, Also, we could do our virtual machines. So let's just take a look at the virtual machines that we have running on this ESXi host. So here, we can monitor the CPU usage percentage, see what our current VM that we have up and running on this ESXi host, how much they're consuming. I have here my vCenter server. This is deployed as a virtual machine on ESXi 1. I have also a small Linux VM here. And also I have another VM here, or vSphere Management Assistant. Okay, and these are highlighted with different colors here so we could easily view them. The same thing for our memory usage here. Okay, percentage of memory utilization. So basically, from this here, we could gather that our vCenter virtual machine it's consuming the highest amount of resources in terms of CPU and memory resources on this ESXi host. So over here, it's in a yellow here too. So that's from memory. We could monitor our network. Well, these basically are our 4 core resources: our CPU, memory, our disk, and network. Here we have our network in megabits per second. So basically, the other 2 VMs aren't using a lot of our network resources right now, other than um, our vSphere Management Assistant, or actually for this period, I should say, for this day. Okay. What we could do is change this to real time and just have a look back at this again. So this is kilobytes per second here. So basically, we don't have a lot of this usage right now. So let me pull this up for real time. So this refreshes every 20 seconds too. Actually, it's stated here. So the graph refreshes every 20 seconds. So this is in real time. We were looking at a day just now of data. Okay, so basically my management assistant and my vCenter server are using most of my memory memory on this particular host. All right, CPU, my vCenter server there, and this would fluctuate because, as I mentioned, we're looking at a real-time chart here. Okay, so let me move over here to our advanced view. So in our advanced view here, we have lots more options. By default, this is set to our CPU view here. If you click the drop down here, these are the different objects we could view. Okay, we could refresh the view here. Here's where we could export our chart. So we have a couple options here for exporting. So once we select one of them here, it will just prompt us where we want to export this to. So let's cancel out of this for now. We have a little legend at the bottom here. But mostly we would want to work with our chart options once we are under the advanced view. So currently we are looking at CPU, and this is in real time. Okay. Um, let's say we are looking at network. Okay, so we would have an indication over on the left here, network in real time. Let's just put this back. So we're looking at CPU. So currently we are looking at percentage CPU utilization here. We have megahertz over on the right. So let's just go under chart options. So over on the left here we have our chart metrics. So based on what we select here, we would have a different view of the different counters that we could select or uncheck here to view. Okay, so if we go this here, we would have a different list of our counters here. But we'll get back into this in a little bit. We could look at highest latency. This is selected by default. For networking, we have a different list here too. Our data transmit rate, receive rate. These are the default that are selected. Okay. So you have your core resources here. We have this in real time. We could change this. So if you're monitoring for a specific period, okay, we could enter that in here. The type of chart, okay, star graph, a line graph, okay. We could select those here. We have the option here to save this setting. So let's say we would have modified this. Let's say we go into CPU and we're looking at the CPU ready value. This is in millisecond. Okay, say we're looking at that. We come down here. Let's see if we need to monitor anything else in here. And say we just need the percentage utilization or usage. So we don't want in megahertz. So we're selecting that there. Let's come over to this. Okay. So let me just expand this out a little bit. So for this, let's come down here. We'll leave latency. Let's see what else we could select here. Okay, we have our read-write rate already select here too. Let me go over to networking. Okay, so receive packets drop. I want to monitor that, and transmit packets that are dropped too. I need to monitor that. Okay, so I've changed this up a little bit. What I could do here is save this. Let's give this a name. Actually, let me cancel this and say I need to monitor that for a week. Okay, so say for last week I need to monitor that. Okay, so we don't have a lot of options here. Let's do the Sabre monitoring for the last day. Okay. So the general idea here is we go in here, we add some additional counters. Okay. Um, what I'm trying to demonstrate is we could save this and give this a name. Okay. Actually, let me just change this back again. Sorry about that. And then we'll save this. Okay, so let's just give this a okay. I'll select OK here. And once I hit on OK here, I'll have the view just for the last day with the counters that we would have changed. Okay. Um, Here, if we need to go back to where we were CPU, we could just hit back that. But right now we're doing a custom view and we're just viewing our chart for these counters over the last day. If I come back into chart options here, I have the option of deleting this. So if I go to delete options, I could also load this chart by default at startup. Okay. So let me go this modify chart, that is. Let me go over to delete options here and I'll just remove this last day chart. Okay. So I'll just remove that and then hit on OK here. Okay, so that's all I wanted to demonstrate in this section here, just how to navigate our performance charts and the different views we have for this. What I'll do now is go back to our slides and then we'll go through the 4 core resources that we could monitor. That is our CPU, our memory, our disk resource, and our network resource. And some of the most common techniques you'd use for monitoring, both from the guest OS level and at the host level, and some of the more common counters that you would want to select to monitor. Okay, so let's get back to our slides. So if we are monitoring our CPU resources for a VM, we may use the task manager within Windows. This is within our guest OS. We could use the task manager, or from outside of the guest OS, we could use our performance chart. Both of them we could use to get the complete picture. This should give us a good idea if our VM is being constrained by CPU resource. So let's say, for example, our VM CPU is high. The CPU usage is high for an extended period of time. We may conclude that the VM is constrained by CPU resources. This may be happening within the VM, whilst the host may have enough free CPU resources that can be allocated for that VM. This is due to the fact that the guest OS assumes that it is running out of CPU resources, when really it needs some more CPU cores allocated to it from the ESXi host. So basically, the VM doesn't know that it's running, or the guest OS doesn't know that it's running within a VM, since the VM kernel is scheduling access to the logical processors on the ESXi host. So all that's needed, we could just add some additional CPUs for that virtual machine. Once the host have that capacity, and that should solve our issue there. Okay, so sometimes we run task manager and we see, okay, we are at 90% CPU utilization, when really we could just add some additional cores to that virtual machine and fix that immediately. If we find that we are in a situation where multiple VMs is constrained by CPU, we may want to take a look at the CPU ready time value. Okay, So the CPU ready time value, this is the interval when a VM is ready to execute a task, but it cannot execute that task, or that task cannot be scheduled on the CPU. So a contributing factor to this is when we have too many VMs that are running on one particular host. So if we add the CPU ready counters, and we actually find this as the source of our problem, we may need to add some additional CPUs on our ESXi host, or migrate them over to another host with additional host CPU capacity to run those VM. Ideally though, for you to determine the ideal CPU ready value for your environment, you may need to create a baseline. Create a baseline with data captured of your workload over a period. So this would give you a more accurate picture for your CPU resource monitoring. When we are monitoring memory resources, I'm finding the ballooning activity is high and the guest OS is swapping, our VM is then constrained for memory. So recall in the advanced vSphere course, I said that Balloon Driver reclaims some of the VM's physical memory to be reallocated. So ballooning is not necessarily a bad thing, but if there is a high ballooning over a period of time, the guest OS would start to page. And this is an indication that the VM is constrained for memory. Okay. Next, we could monitor our host level swapping to determine if our host memory is overcommitted. If we find that the VM itself is being swapped by the VM kernel, we would need to increase our host memory or move the VM over to another host, migrate it to another host with additional memory capacity, or this resource. So this intensive applications within our guest OS, they can saturate our storage our path storage. So to determine if our storage paths are saturated, we would need to measure the throughput and latency between our VMs and the particular storage. So here we can use our performance charts to measure read and write rates as well as read and write latency. For our host objects, we could measure throughput and latency for our data stores, our storage adapters, or storage paths. For VM objects, we could measure throughput and latency for the VM data store or the virtual disk. So to determine this performance problems, we also we may need to measure our kernel command latency and the physical device command latency counters. Okay, so the kernel command latency counter, this measure the average time that the VM kernel spends processing individual iSCSI commands. Ideal value for this is between 0 and 1 millisecond. Numbers over 2 to 3 millisecond in the kernel command latency counter typically indicates that we have an overworked array. So you'll need to fix that at the array level or add some additional paths there. The physical device command latency counter, this is the average time it takes for our physical device to complete a SCSI command. Okay, so for a physical device command latency, VMware recommendation numbers for this is between 15 to 20. Sorry, between 15 to 20 millisecond represents a slower overworked array. So you would want to get this lower than 15. Okay. So let's move on here to our network resource. So similarly to this performance issues, network performance issues are typically caused by link saturations between a client and server system. There are some things we can do to ensure that our virtual machines are not constrained by network. First, we'd want to ensure that our VM have the enhanced network drivers installed by installing the VMware tools on our virtual machine. To measure the effective bandwidth between VMs and our client server model for that matter, you can use the IO meter within the VM to determine if packets are being dropped. We could also monitor drop transmit and drop receive network counters for a particular VM, but we could do this outside of the guest OS. So if you're at the host level, we could add these counters for that VM outside of it. For bandwidth utilization between the VMs, as I mentioned, we could use the IO meter. Okay, so this is all I wanted to cover for resource monitoring from the performance chart perspective. In the next module, I'll cover the theoretical part of ESX stop and remote ESX stop before getting into the demonstration on our command line.